Imagine yourself as a Roman senator walking the winding streets of the Suburra, the infamous pleasure district of Rome. The night is thick with torch smoke and the stench of spilled wine, where the laughter of drunkards mixes with the shrill calls of prostitutes. You are no stranger to the chaos of these streets. Senators often whispered of them. Soldiers came here to forget campaigns, and merchants squandered fortunes in the shadows of taverns. But tonight, something stops you cold. Through the smoke, in a dimly lit brothel, you glimpse a woman unlike the others. Beneath her painted cheeks and tawdry dress lies a face you know too well. Your heart nearly stops as you recognize her. This is no common prostitute. This is Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife of Emperor Claudius, servicing clients for coins, competing with the lowest women of the empire. And this is no desperate woman driven by hunger or slavery. No, this is Rome's most powerful woman, sneaking out of the Palatine palace in disguise, willingly descending into degradation for the thrill of anonymous encounters. You thought you understood Roman decadence. You thought Caligula embodied excess. What you are about to discover will make Caligula seem almost restrained. For Rome's third empress did not merely abuse her position. She weaponized her sexuality in ways that terrified even Rome's hardened elite and ultimately sealed her horrific fate. The story begins in perfection, not scandal. In the year 38 after Christ, the empire celebrated what seemed the ideal marriage. Valeria Messalina, only 15 years old, married Emperor Claudius in a ceremony that represented all that Romans valued: nobility, fertility, and the continuation of divine bloodlines. She was everything an empress was expected to be: young, beautiful, and from one of the oldest patrician families. She could give the empire airs of unquestioned legitimacy. Claudius himself, 13 years her senior, seemed deeply grateful. Awkward and frail, afflicted with a limp and a stammer that modern medicine identifies as cerebral palsy, he was often underestimated by the Senate and mocked by the Praetorian Guard. To him, Messalina was a prize beyond measure. Contemporary descriptions painted her as a classical beauty, skin pale as ivory, golden hair catching the light, delicate features refined by generations of aristocratic breeding. She quickly bore Claudius 2 children, a son and a daughter, and stood beside him at religious festivals, her white stola a symbol of Roman chastity. To the empire, she seemed the perfect matron, but Roman society was rigid in its moral code. Women were divided into 2 categories: virtuous wives and mothers on one side, entertainers and prostitutes on the other. The highest virtue of an empress was to embody pudicitia, the sacred chastity and modesty of womanhood. Even a whisper of impropriety could destabilize the empire, shaking confidence in its leadership. And so the contrast between Messalina's public role and her secret life was not simply scandalous, it was dangerous to Rome itself. Behind the marble walls of the Palatine Palace, the transformation began almost imperceptibly. Servants noticed strange dismissals late at night. Guards ordered away without explanation. She claimed fatigue, yet not long after, figures saw her slip away dressed in simple tunics that concealed her identity. At first, it seemed like youthful rebellion, the harmless adventures of a girl suffocated by ceremony. But soon her wanderings revealed a disturbing purpose. Messalina did not simply wander, she observed. With the intensity of a general preparing for war, she studied Rome's prostitutes. She memorized their routines, their gestures, their territories. She listened to the words they used, noted how they enticed clients, and how they survived endless nights. This was not curiosity. It was research. She was preparing herself for something greater. Her first dramatic descent into the Suburra came during the festival of Saturnalia in the year 40 after Christ. For 1 week each year, Roman society inverted itself. Masters served slaves, nobles dined with beggars, order dissolved into chaos. It was during this upheaval that Messalina seized her chance. Disguised as an ordinary woman, she slipped into a brothel and approached the keeper. She asked to work for the night. He thought her just another bored aristocrat, seeking a thrill. But what followed shocked even hardened veterans of the trade. Messalina outlasted them all. She serviced more clients than the house's most seasoned prostitutes. As dawn approached and others collapsed from exhaustion, she demanded more, refusing to leave, intoxicated by her own defilement. Finally, the brothel keeper forced her out. But by then, the revelation had consumed her. She had found ecstasy not in dignity, but in disgrace. From that moment, she transformed her nocturnal adventures into a system. Within months, she created a network of loyal servants who disguised her, smuggled her out of the palace, and invented false names. What began as a dangerous game became a routine. Messalina was not content with anonymity. She wanted competition. She began organizing contests with prostitutes, wagering enormous sums on her ability to endure more clients in a single night. The news spread in whispers. The Empress was not merely participating in Rome's sexual underground, she was turning it into a gladiatorial arena of flesh. The most infamous contest came in the year 41 after Christ. Messalina challenged Sila, the most celebrated courtesan in Rome, to an endurance duel. The rules were simple. From sunset to dawn, whoever took the most clients would win a fortune in gold. Aristocrats packed the hidden venue, concealing their faces, wagering on the outcome. Sila, experienced and cautious, paced herself, conserving energy. By dawn, she had taken 25 clients and declared victory. But Messalina was relentless. She pressed on, surpassing 30, her hunger unquenched, demanding more even when no volunteers remained. Silence fell over the room. They were not witnessing scandal, they were witnessing compulsion. The implications were staggering. This was not desperation. This was the Empress of Rome choosing humiliation as entertainment, intoxicated by the contrast between her public dignity and her private degradation. The greater the gulf between those worlds, the greater her satisfaction. And yet, this was only the beginning. For once Messalina discovered her appetite, she realized it could be more than pleasure. It could be power. And when she learned to combine lust with politics, Rome itself would tremble. By the year 42 after Christ, Messalina's nocturnal escapades had already grown infamous among those who dared whisper about them. What had begun as a rebellious thrill was hardening into obsession. For her, degradation was no longer occasional indulgence. It had become her very identity. The Empress of Rome was living two lives. By day, the dutiful wife and mother, serene beside Claudius at ceremonies. By night, a shadow slipping through alleys, hungering for the filth and anonymity of the brothel. Her first encounters had revealed something intoxicating. She realized that what enthralled her was not simply lust, but the transformation itself, the collapse of barriers between majesty and humiliation. In the Senate House, she was untouchable. In the brothel, she was nothing. And yet, that nothingness exhilarated her. The greater the contrast, the more intense the thrill. But for Messalina, indulgence was never enough. She was competitive by nature. To her, the streets of Rome were not merely places of pleasure, they were arenas. She began returning with new purpose, not to experience, but to dominate. Her servants became accomplices in a carefully engineered system. They smuggled her out at night, often under the cover of official errands. Disguises were perfected. Coarse tunics, scarves covering her hair, soot smeared on her cheeks. False identities were crafted ordinary names that allowed her to pass among Rome's lowest classes. Those who aided her were bound by loyalty, bribery, or fear. To betray the empress was to risk death. Soon, she escalated from participation to competition. She turned sex into spectacle. Whispers spread of endurance contests, wagers placed, aristocrats sneaking into hidden venues to watch the empress battle Rome's most seasoned prostitutes. The infamous duel with Scylla in the year 41 after Christ had already shocked Rome's underworld, but Messalina did not stop there. She staged other contests, pitting herself against multiple women at once. Patrons placed bets in secret, wealthy men gathered in candlelit rooms, and Messalina performed like a gladiator of flesh. The very wife of the emperor was degrading herself for their amusement, and yet they watched in silence, too horrified to speak and too enthralled to leave. These spectacles revealed something more disturbing. Messalina was not motivated by coin or desperation. She sought victory. She wanted to prove that no woman in Rome could outlast her. Her satisfaction was not purely physical, but psychological, the triumph of an empress proving herself superior in the very arena meant to degrade her. Roman society, already jaded by excess, was unsettled. They had seen emperors indulge in perversions before. They had seen Caligula revel in cruelty, Tiberius in depravity. But never had an empress turned the virtue of her station into its opposite. Messalina was supposed to embody chastity. Instead, she flaunted corruption. For those who observed, the implications were terrifying. The empress was not content to simply misbehave in secret. She was crafting a new form of dominance, one that inverted every Roman expectation of morality. Writers like Tacitus and Juvenal would later describe her behavior with tones of disbelief, as if words themselves struggled to capture the enormity of her fall. They claimed that even when dawn came, when the other women collapsed, Messalina demanded more. One account describes her returning home, washing the grime of the brothel from her body, and appearing at Claudius's side as though nothing had happened. The emperor, trusting and oblivious, never suspected the double life of his wife. But Messalina's hunger had grown beyond the thrill of anonymous encounters. She began to sense that her secret could be transformed into something else. If she could degrade herself without consequence, what else might she manipulate? If the most powerful men in Rome were willing to watch her debase herself in silence, what might they endure if she directed her energies toward power? Here lies the pivot in Messalina's story. Lust alone could not satisfy her. Competition was thrilling, but fleeting. What she craved now was permanence. She began to imagine a system, a way to fuse her appetite with political ambition. By the year 42 after Christ, she would take her next step, one that shifted her from scandalous empress to genuine threat to the empire itself. She would create an institution unlike anything Rome had ever seen. An aristocratic brothel, staffed not by slaves, but by noble women, its clients, the very men who governed Rome. Before long, Messalina would no longer simply compete with prostitutes. She would command them. She would turn shame itself into her weapon. By the year 42 after Christ, Messalina had crossed a boundary that few could have imagined. What had begun as scandalous indulgence was now institutionalized corruption. She was no longer content to slip into brothels disguised as a commoner. She wanted control, not only of her own degradation, but of Rome's ruling class. So she established what historians would later describe as the boldest criminal enterprise in the history of the empire. The operation was hidden in plain sight, a villa near the Campus Martius, outwardly a fashionable house for private gatherings. But within those marble walls, Messalina created a brothel of unprecedented design. Its workers were not slaves, nor the daughters of beggars. They were women of noble birth aristocrats coerced into service by the empress herself. Some were threatened with financial ruin, others with disgrace, many with violence against their families. Refusal was impossible. To oppose Messalina was to oppose the imperial household itself. This was not mere decadence, it was strategy. Messalina deliberately targeted the empire's most powerful men. Senators whispered their dissent in the Senate House by day, only to find themselves trapped in her villa by night, stripped not only of their clothes but of their dignity. Military commanders who entertained dreams of rebellion found themselves compromised in her chambers. Wealthy merchants guilty of tax evasion or smuggling discovered their secrets laid bare. Messalina's true brilliance lay in how she weaponized intimacy. Every encounter was observed. Servants listened behind curtains, recording conversations, noting weaknesses, cataloging betrayals. The Empress had built a network of espionage so effective that within months she knew more about Rome's elite than Claudius himself. She knew which senators plotted, which generals wavered in loyalty, which merchants evaded taxes, which nobles harbored forbidden desires. She transformed shame into chains stronger than iron. Those who fell into her trap dared not resist her wishes, for exposure would mean ruin. Thus, the proudest men in Rome, guardians of its laws, leaders of its armies, were reduced to silent puppets dancing to the Empress's will. The corruption spread like poison. Decisions that once reflected debate in the Senate began to twist. Military appointments went to unqualified candidates who enjoyed the Empress's favor. Trade agreements mysteriously benefited obscure merchants. Imperial decrees seemed arbitrary, favoring those connected not to Claudius but to Messalina's hidden network. To the outside world, Rome still gleamed with marble and power. But beneath, its decision-making was rotting. And still, secrecy did not satisfy her. By the year 44 after Christ, Messalina escalated her schemes. It was no longer enough to control Rome's leaders in the shadows. She wanted their humiliation made ritual. And so she cloaked her perversions in religion. She began hosting elaborate ceremonies, presented as festivals in honor of gods and goddesses. Attendance was mandatory. Senators, generals, their wives, even foreign envoys were summoned under the pretense of piety. At first, the rituals appeared legitimate. Incense rising, hymns sung, priests chanting invocations. Yet step by step, the ceremonies twisted. Wine flowed too freely, torches burned low, the music grew suggestive. Gradually, the sacred dissolved into the obscene. What unfolded horrified even Rome's jaded elite. Political rivals were forced into degrading acts before their peers, mocked openly by Messalina as she presided like a priestess of corruption. Senators who once thundered against imperial policies now found themselves naked and broken, their dignity stripped away not by execution but by ridicule. Messalina had discovered a weapon more powerful than the sword: shared shame. Worse still, she ensnared the young. Sons and daughters of Rome's most respected families were drawn into these spectacles, told that their participation was necessary for religious authenticity. These were youths raised to believe in the sanctity of imperial command. They obeyed without question, only to find themselves complicit in acts that would destroy their honor forever. Parents, already compromised, could neither protect nor expose them. To reveal the truth would be to doom their families entirely. Thus, Messalina wove a net so intricate that none could escape. Senators, generals, and nobles alike became her captives, bound not by chains but by the terror of disgrace. Foreign ambassadors noticed the change. In negotiations, once proud senators stammered, their eyes darting with guilt. Military commanders appeared distracted, hesitant, broken. Rome's ruling class, the very backbone of empire, had been shattered not by war, but by an empress who understood the devastating power of humiliation. Yet, for Messalina, even this was not enough. Secrecy, blackmail, manipulation, they thrilled her, but she longed for more. She did not wish to remain a shadowy power behind the throne. She wanted recognition. She wanted to rule not as Claudius's wife, but as sovereign in her own right. By the year 48 after Christ, her ambition would drive her into madness. She would stage an act so audacious that even Rome, accustomed to scandal, would recoil in disbelief. She would marry another man publicly, legally, while Claudius still lived. It was no longer scandal. It was treason. By the year 48 after Christ, Messalina's lust for power had outgrown secrecy. Blackmail, espionage, and ritualized degradation were no longer enough. She craved legitimacy, open recognition as the true ruler of Rome. And so, with Claudius away in Ostia inspecting grain shipments, she staged her most audacious act yet, a wedding. This was no whispered affair, no clandestine tryst. It was a full Roman marriage, complete with priests, official contracts, and witnesses drawn from Rome's highest families. The groom was Gaius Silius, a young senator renowned for his beauty and ambition. By law, the union was valid. In effect, Messalina had declared herself divorced from Claudius and remarried while still holding the title of empress. The implications were staggering. Roman law recognized the marriage. If left unchallenged, it meant Claudius's throne was vacant, and Silius stood poised to replace him. It was treason dressed in wedding garlands. The celebration spiraled into excess. For days the villa thundered with music, wine spilled like rivers, and Rome's remaining nobles, bound by blackmail or fear, attended in uneasy silence. What had once been hidden behind the mask of religion was now blatant. Messalina was not pretending anymore. She stood before Rome as bride to another man, mocking the emperor himself. At first, Silius basked in his fortune. He was the empress's chosen, elevated to the role of her consort, but quickly the gravity of his position dawned upon him. He was no longer simply a lover. He was Rome's would-be emperor, marked as a usurper by every senator and soldier loyal to Claudius. Ancient writers record his desperation. He begged Messalina to end the madness, to annul the marriage before it was too late. But Messalina was intoxicated by delusion. She spoke of ruling as his empress, of replacing Claudius with ease, convinced that the web of shame she had spun around Rome's elite would hold. Meanwhile, Claudius remained unaware. His freedmen, the loyal advisors who managed his court, agonized over how to break the news. How could they tell the emperor that his wife had legally married another man in his absence? At first, Claudius dismissed the reports as slander. Even for Messalina, this seemed impossible. But the evidence grew undeniable. Witness testimony, marriage contracts, whispers that reached him even in Ostia. Slowly, disbelief hardened into fear. Claudius was not a man of great courage, but in that moment, survival roused him. If Messalina's coup succeeded, civil war loomed. He had no choice but to act. The response was swift. Claudius ordered his freedmen to summon loyal troops. The Praetorian Guard, bound by duty and bribes, marched into Rome. For the first time in years, the balance of power shifted. Messalina's web of shame could not withstand the clatter of shields and swords echoing through the streets. Silius was the first to fall. Dragged from his house, he was executed without trial, his beauty and ambition extinguished in an instant. The nobles who had supported Messalina scattered, discarding togas, fleeing like criminals. The empire's ruling class, once enslaved by shame, now sought to save themselves through betrayal. Messalina herself fled to the gardens of Lucullus, a place once famed for luxury, now turned into her prison. There, surrounded by her last attendants, she wrote frantic messages to Claudius, begging for an audience. She believed that if she could see him, as she had countless times before, she could seduce him into forgiveness. For years, she had manipulated him, softened his resolve, charmed him into overlooking her scandals. Why should this time be different? But Claudius's freedmen knew better. They feared that if she were allowed into his presence, she would bend his will once more. They urged him to act quickly, to strike before her voice could reach him. Claudius, weary and bewildered, agreed. In the gardens, her mother Lepida came to her. Their relationship had been strained for years. Lepida despised her daughter's excesses, and yet, in that final hour, she pitied her. She urged Messalina to die with dignity, to take her own life and preserve at least a fragment of honor. "Do not beg," she is said to have whispered. "Die as an empress should." But Messalina was not made for dignity. A dagger was placed in her trembling hand. She raised it, then faltered. The empress who had mocked senators, humiliated generals, and enslaved Rome with shame could not summon the courage to end her own life. In the end, it was a soldier who drove his blade into her, silencing her forever. Her death, however, was not enough for Rome. The city demanded erasure. Claudius ordered her statues destroyed, her name scraped from inscriptions, her memory condemned by damnatio memoriae. To speak of her became treason. The woman who had enslaved Rome's leaders with humiliation was herself annihilated by the state's ultimate weapon, official forgetting. Yet, for all the marble inscriptions erased and all the statues shattered, Messalina's shadow lingers. She was not merely an immoral empress. She was a mirror of Rome itself, a civilization that demanded virtue yet drowned in vice, that preached order while delighting in chaos. She embodied the contradictions of an empire that celebrated chastity yet consumed debauchery, that upheld family honor yet feasted on scandal. For a time, she ruled through shame. Senators cowered, generals obeyed, nobles trembled at her will. But power built on humiliation is fragile. It corrodes its foundations. When her delusion of sovereignty collided with Rome's instinct to survive, the empire cast her aside with brutal efficiency. Thus ended Messalina, once the perfect bride, celebrated in white stola at her wedding, now reduced to a corpse in the gardens of Lucullus. She had sought to turn disgrace into dominance, shame into sovereignty. For a while, she succeeded. But in the end, Rome reminded her that no web of manipulation can withstand the blade of survival, and her fate leaves behind a question that still echoes. How much corruption can a society endure before it collapses from within? Rome's answer came in blood and silence. For Messalina, shame was power. For Rome, shame was her undoing.